had a huge impact on reformers on the whole European continent. And they tried to, carry through such market-oriented reforms and change the law. For instance, abolish serfdom, which was one of the demands of Adam Smith. But that was not easy, because you had very powerful groups which were losers of these reforms. And therefore, the choice was only between buying out the losers or having a clash, a revolution, might be strife, might be a long-lasting strife, might be a civil war. All this is possible. And the strategies which were used in Europe were quite different. During the French Revolution, serfdom and the sharecropping system was abolished in the year 1792 with a stroke of a pen. That is, the nobility lost all their privileges without, first they were compensated, but that was not a credible commitment. Then the compensation was abolished. In Prussia, on the other hand, the same reforms were also made, but against compensation. The serfs had to compensate the nobility, and if they could not, which was mostly the case, they had to give some of their land to the nobility. That was less just, but it worked in the sense, at least, that agricultural productivity increased considerably. Now, this is the dilemma of all reformers. And the dilemma is the reformers have to do with entrenched interests, people fighting for their privileges which they had before, not willing to give up their privileges. And then what comes on top of this is that often those who suffer from reform, who are the losers, are a concentrated group. They lose much, as for instance the land owners in Iceland, which I mentioned yesterday. There were a small group, but they would have lost a lot, whereas the benefits of reforms are often dispersed. So everybody has a small benefit. And the first social scientist who noticed this asymmetry between winners and losers of reforms was no other man than Machiavelli. Perhaps you have heard of Machiavelli, who wrote in the 14th century. And he wrote in his famous book, and I must quote from my memory, he said, "A reformer has always a stiff opposition against him, and he gets lukewarm support. And the support is lukewarm because the benefits are spread among many." But still, a successful reformer is one who can overcome these obstacles to reform, these entrenched interests, and make the reform, if possible, Pareto improving, that is, nobody loses from the reform, or at least can reduce the losses to some extent, so that there is that the opposition against the reform becomes not too strong. So the obvious method of making a reform with winners and losers viable is simply to buy out the losers. And this is possible because the reform leads to a huge gain for the economy, and even if you compensate the losers, you still have the net gains from the reform. So it is in principle possible. Why is it then so difficult? You know, I come back to the example of the Maharajas in India. So the simplest way to overcome the opposition of the Maharajas to establish the state of India would have been simply to buy them off, to say, well, you get so and so much money and give us your titles and give that should all become now, the Hyderabad should become a state of India, what is it, Andhra Pradesh should become a normal state, and you go wherever you want to go. You can stay in India or wherever, but you lose your privileges as a Maharaja. Now, of course, this was not possible due to the fiscal constraints. So what India did, they offered the Maharajas a prepurse, they got a yearly payment, but this was, of course, not credible because they gave up their power, and after they have given up their power, then the new powers, they can do what they want. And that is exactly what's happening. Now, this shows you that there is a time inconsistency problem involved here. Now, one method to overcome this inconsistency, time inconsistency problem is simply to have grandfather clauses. Now, I give you an example. In many countries in the world, including in Europe, we have labor laws, which are pro-worker labor laws, which protect the workers very comprehensively, which is in principle a good thing, but it goes sometimes so far that workers cannot be dismissed, that it is almost impossible to dismiss a worker. And this is not good for the economy because it prevents markets, labor markets, and product markets from being flexible. It ties up capital in sick industries. Sometimes these industries are then subsidized with tax money and so on. And all this has a negative impact on the overall economy. How to change that? That is very difficult. We have now the problem in France. Everybody agrees that in France the protection of laborers has been overdone, and that the labor markets must be more reflexive. So when one wants to change this, one has the stiff opposition, of course, from labor unions and so on. They go on strike, and you have these strikes and so on. It's almost impossible to change things. Now, one method to overcome this problem then is to introduce so-called grandfathering clauses. That is, you can say, everybody who has a job in the industry right now keeps his privileges or her privileges. That is, for them, the old laws, the old rules apply. He cannot be dismissed. But for all the outsiders who get a new job now under the more flexible rule, this does not apply. So that is a method of overcoming stiff resistance. You see what I mean? Another thing is, and I come back now to Rawls and to Avinash Dixit, is packaging in such a way that you have a package of reform, and this package has winners. Let's say one parcel of the package has winners and losers, another parcel of the package has winners and losers. But if you take the package, the whole package, then everybody does not really know whether he is a winner or a loser. so there is identity dislocation. So the people are behind the veil of ignorance. And then they might agree to reform because they expect to be a winner, even though in a particular case they might be losers. Well, the privy purse I have already touched. I come to one more also very important point, which is related to the protection of property, especially of private property. Now, if you compare North America, let's say Canada and the United States, with South America, and I'm especially talking about the United States, then there is one marked difference between a country, let's say like Brazil or Colombia or Peru on the one hand, and the United States on the other hand. In the United States, when they became independent and had made their, they had their war of independence against the British, people like Jefferson or George Washington, who were both millionaires, they were very rich people. And according to our today's, we would call them millionaires. But they were not so rich as to be able to transform their wealth into political influence. So their political influence was not bigger, I mean, except that they were politicians, of course, but their richness and their wealth did not make them more influential than other people, than any other people. And they knew exactly that if wealth concentrates too much in a society, if some people share all the wealth, then you cannot protect property, because the influential people, the rich people, they can easily transform their wealth into political power. And that was the case in South America, where the conquistadores, the Spanish conquerors, they were so rich that they owned the whole country, more or less. There were a group of 20, 30 families owning the whole country. And for that, you do not need property, you do not need law. They just coordinate their interest in the golf club or whatever, wherever, and they do then what is good for them. And therefore, if you have many rich people, this is good for the country. But if you have a small group of people owning the whole country, that is bad for the country. And then these people are not interested in reforms. And that is one of the big problems of Latin America, even today, even after 600 or 500 years after the conquest of Latin America. You have these offsprings of the conquistadores who own the whole country. And then reform is almost impossible or very, very difficult. Now, I give you now still two contemporary examples of successful reforms. China is perhaps the most noteworthy country of a successful reform. And it is interesting that the reformer, Deng Xiaoping, who was the mind behind all this, before he became party chairman of the Communist Party, he went to a visit, I think for several weeks, many weeks, I think even more than a month or so. He was in the United States, visited companies in the United States, and he got the feeling that this is what also China needed. So the United States was somehow his model. So he came back and said, we have to introduce a system which resembles that of the United States. But he learned very quickly that if he did this, if he did such a radical reform in China, this would have led probably to not probably, certainly, to a stiff opposition from the party establishment, because then the party establishment would lose all their privileges. And it might have led to a kind of civil war in China. And to avoid this, Deng Xiaoping decided to make a reform which did not deeply cut into the privileges of the big figures and the privileges of the Communist Party and their leading members. And therefore, he introduced what the Chinese themselves call the dual-track system, dual-track method. That is, he left the whole economy as it was. You know, he did not cut into the privileges of directors, of companies, of the steel companies, the coal companies, and so on. That was all left as it was, completely, totally untouched. And he only liberalized the fringes, you know, the undeveloped, those parts of the economy which were undeveloped. And he reformed agriculture. He transformed agriculture again to a kind of not private agriculture, but very close to a private agriculture, which did not meet with stiff opposition there. So with these two reforms, you know, liberalizing agriculture and liberalizing the undeveloped sector, let's say, of consumer good, production of industrial consumer goods, that was all liberalized, but the old sector remained totally as it was, and thus preserved the privileges of the members of the Communist Party. And therefore, he could overcome the opposition of his own party. And that made him a successful reformer, because agriculture boomed very quickly, and the previously non-existing sector of consumer goods, industrial consumer goods, exploded. And his hope was that the new capitalist sector would would attract workers from the old socialist sector, so that over time this problem would totally disappear. That was, and in some sense, he was successful with this. Whether it will be very successful in the very long run, and whether or not a country like India has now the better legal and political structures, that is a question for the future. But to sum this up, the reforms of Deng Xiaoping were successful because he understood, like all great reformers, that one has to overcome the obstacles, the opposition of those who would lose from the reforms. And if one studies the so-called Asian tiger states, Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, and Taiwan, then first what one has to say, these four countries are the only countries in the world, in the whole world, which were very poor 100 years ago. I told you that in the year 1900, the per capita income of Argentina was 5 times that of South Korea, and now the per capita income of South Korea is 5 times that of Argentina. What explains this? The key to understanding this success, which only 4 countries in the whole world, out of 200 countries, or how many we have, 4 countries achieved this, only 4 countries, is that their leaders fully understood this problem of how to overcome obstacles, and that growth must be all-inclusive. It must, it cannot overlook the opposition and sometimes stiff opposition of potential losers. Okay, so with this I want to conclude.